I'd like to welcome everybody this morning. Wish you a good morning. This is a panel on Mennonite Central Committee and identity formation. And we have three speakers today whom I will be introducing. I'll just say, first of all, myself, Ruth Rempel. I'm here in Winnipeg, and I teach international development studies at Menno Simons College, which is part of the University of, part of the Canadian Mennonite University. So again, welcome. Let me say a little bit about each of the panelists, and I'll present them in the order that they are going to be speaking. And then we'll hear the papers, about 20 minutes each, and follow that with question and answer. So there will not be time for questions after each paper, but after we have heard all three of them. So starting with Eric Schnitger, he has a doctorate from Fuller Theological Seminary in Christian ethics. His research has focused on Mennonite economic ethics and the theology and practices of human interaction with earth systems. Eric is an adjunct professor at Azusa Pacific University in practical theology and philosophy. He chairs the board of Full Circle Thrift Shop, which is a ministry of the Pacific Southwest Mennonite Conference. Eric has also helped found and sits on the Pasadena Mennonite Church Mutual Aid Committee. His paper today will be Mutual Aid and MCC, a way of understanding just economic relationships. Kevin Stewart Rose is a PhD candidate in religious studies at the University of Virginia, where he also serves as lecturer and assistant director of the college transition program. His 2019 work on the More with Less Cookbook appeared in the journal Religion and American Culture. He's currently working on a dissertation titled Living Green, the Neoliberal Climate of Protestant Environmentalism, which focuses on the relationship between formations of American capitalism and American US Protestant engagement with environmentalism in response to the planetary crises of the 1970s. His paper today is titled Menno Markets, 10,000 Villages, More with Less, and the Neoliberal South. Our third presenter is Robert Suderman, who I understand also answers to Jack. He has worked in various ministries of the church for over 50 years. These include teaching, executive administration, international assignments in a number of countries, and pastoral leadership education in more than 30 countries around the world. He has also been deeply engaged in ecumenical circles. Before retirement, he served as the General Secretary of Mennonite Church Canada. Together with his wife, Irene, he is now enjoying retirement in New Hamburg, Ontario. His paper is titled MCC in the Church, a Continuing Saga of Ambiguity. So I'd like to welcome all three panelists, our presenters this morning, and we are making a small change in the order of what was given in the program. So I'm going to ask Eric if he would be willing to start. So your 20 minutes would start now, and I'll give you a 2-minute warning when that comes up.
Thank you, Ruth. And thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm excited about this. Greetings, everyone. I'm giving this paper from Pasadena, California, well unceded, on unceded Tongva land of the Gabrielino people. The Tongva have shepherded and cared for this land since around 500 AD, and the Chumash people before them. I acknowledge the Tongva people not only to remember the colonization of the past and present, but to be reminded that there have always been different ways of organizing our communities and economics, different ways of being with each other. In the present parlance, we might talk about these as economic relationships using complex, value and assumption-laden and often unclear terms, like capitalism and socialism. These terms represent hegemonic and powerful assumptions about more than economics. They imply something about the nature of people and their expectations of relationship with each other for their survival and flourishing. There have been other understandings about these ideas which have fallen out of favor as dominant models. I'll be considering here the practice of mutual aid, a form of economic relationship that many Anabaptists have considered as a lived economic ethic that is faithful to their beliefs. It has also been a dominant model in familial and close kin relationships, even in capitalist and capitalist adjacent societies. Mutual aid has blossomed in interest of late, starting with the Occupy Wall Street movement during the 2007 Great Recession, but also with this COVID pandemic, where mutual aid groups have sprouted up around the United States and elsewhere. I must, however, add a few caveats. First, this paper has veered from its original intent. I think it can be shown by going to the minutes of early MCC meetings and the interests of its founders that they had ideas interrelated with mutual aid from the very beginning. By that, I mean that the goal of the MCC, at least for some of its progenitors, was broader than the charity work of sending relief to Anabaptists suffering in Ukraine and Russia in the early 1900s. Well, it's not until 1941 that the term mutual aid is brought into Anabaptist usage by MCC volunteer J. Winfield Fretz in his doctoral thesis. The animating concerns of mutual aid have been a stream of understanding about the organization and distribution of power, resources, and relationships within Anabaptism. It has always been a theological concern and tension within Anabaptist theology and ethics. And in part, it seeks to answer questions of economic justice. How much of one's resources to keep for oneself, for one's family, for one's church community, or to send elsewhere for the care of others? Due to the pandemic and its impacts on society and on my personal life, the research that I hoped to do was thwarted. Unable to get access to the documents that might show this theme of mutual aid throughout the history of the MCC, I'm going to bring these concerns more rapidly to the present. I'll summarize some of Fretz's ideas of mutual aid, consider some of the mutual aid movements occurring, especially in New York City, and finally ask how this might inform the precious work of the Mennonite Central Committee into the future. As just mentioned, MCC volunteer J. Winfield Fretz coined the term mutual aid in 1941 to talk about how Anabaptists might think about caring for each other. Fretz wrote, "Christian mutual aid is a way of two or more individuals helping each other to achieve their respective goals. This alone implies respect for the personhood of others." Fretz continues to explain how mutual aid respects the humanity of everyone involved. After discussing moments of mutual aid in the Hebrew Bible and Christian New Testament, he asks his readers to consider how a family works. He says, "The good family is one where every member can make their proper contribution. Here we see two or more individuals working together voluntarily to attain a common goal. It is this family pattern of mutual relations that Jesus said was characteristic of the kingdom of God." Interestingly, Fretz never provides a robust description of mutual aid. In fact, he's deliberately ambiguous because the plurality of expressions of mutual aid and an openness to the many forms that working towards unifying people into a common goal of care and concern can take. Again, he writes, "Whether mutual aid is organized or unorganized, formal or informal, contractual or non-contractual, whether it is practiced by a small group or by a nation, it can be characterized as having a common purpose and seeking a common good. Moreover, the participants in practicing mutual aid always admit, either consciously or unconsciously, that they can achieve through common efforts what they can't accomplish singly." I think it is important here to note that for Fretz, we cannot respect the dignity of all people and their equality without something like mutual aid. Mutual aid is different from charity in a variety of ways that will be discussed shortly. Fretz's idea was similar to the historical term community of need, a term used by the earliest Anabaptists. Balthasar Hubmaier wrote in 1526, "Concerning community of goods, I have always said that everyone should be concerned about the needs of others, so that the hungry might be fed, the thirsty given drink, and the naked clothed. For we're not lords of our possessions, but stewards and distributors." For Hubmaier, this idea of the community of goods was for the purpose of living out the commands of Jesus, such as in Matthew 18, the parable of the sheep and the goats. Hubmaier here is less concerned with the interchange of mutual aid and equal dignity of persons as theological recognition that people's possessions are not owned with an absolute right of private property, but as stewards of those goods to share with generosity to make sure everyone is cared for. Because the history of mutual aid among Anabaptists has less often included robust descriptions, Joseph Katva argues that there is too much ambiguity in the concept. He writes, "Everything from communal living to music festivals, from church-based education to non-religious cooperatives, and from care of the needy to assisting enemies falls into the mutual aid basket. Mutual aid can become very fuzzy very quickly. To that end, it might be helpful to identify two things that mutual aid is not. It is not charity, and it is not insurance. Fretzmos especially wants people to recognize that mutual aid and charity are not the same. This is because even with the best of intentions, charity often creates a power dynamic between the haves and have-nots. While his discussion of this contains some of the racist and colonialist presumptions of those racialized as white in the United States of the 1940s, he's able to see that reciprocation is necessary to have relationships between those understood as equals, even as they have access differently to resources. Charity is often a one-way relationship. He writes, "We who are rich give to the poor. We who are well-fed give to those who are hungry. We who are well-clothed contribute our cast-offs to those who should be thankful for anything we give them. All of this is done with a kind of psychologically subtle attitude of condescension." If a relationship is based on charity, then that possibly excludes it being one of mutual aid. That mutual aid is not insurance is a very interesting story, and I can't tell it fully here for time constraints, but let me say a couple of remarks about it. First, insurance is a mutual form of support, whereby people contribute to a common fund, which will then protect their assets. To participate in insurance is to have assets and the extra means to contribute financially to a common fund. As such, insurance is a financialized form of working towards the common good, which excludes those without ways to contribute financially. Mutual aid holds that while financial support is a component, one's labor, knowledge, or other forms of contribution are equally valued. Finally, and tellingly of the difficulty of mutual aid in a culture that operates by different principles, all but 2 of the Mennonite mutual aid funds no longer exist. The non-existent mutual aid funds, of which there used to be over 100 in Canada and the United States, slowly combined down to 1. And that one, Mennonite Aid Union, closed its doors in 2007. There is still another company called Max, but it was purchased in 2016. And even before that sale, it was indistinguishable from any other insurance company, but that it had a large charity wing. We would also be remiss if we thought that Anabaptists had discovered mutual aid. Although going by many names, this practice of communal care has been present throughout a plurality of human cultures and geographies. At present, it has been seen as a potential alternative to capitalistic forms of social organization. And importantly, it can be a subversive movement that's practiced underneath the dominant capitalistic cultural and economic practices. So that even when you have a capitalist dominant system, you can practice mutual aid on the margins and underneath it. The growing interest in mutual aid, in part, is that it has the power to reorient economic power in democratizing ways. And as a side note, many people have pointed out how interesting it is that many of the countries who claim to prize democracy rarely practice it in economic relationships. Rarely does a company organize itself around democratic decision-making. Rather, they typically operate in top-down power structures where the leadership or owners have a high level of autocratic control. There are some bright moments of resistance, but predominantly worker-owned collectives are the exception in commercial organization. While the language of mutual aid started to reemerge in the larger cultural context of the West during the Great Recession and the Occupy Wall Street movement, it has found more buy-in during the current pandemic, and the potentiality it has created for changing how our communities are structured. The work of Mutual Aid New York City has been one of the most promising groups connecting mutual aid communities together for support, encouragement, and mutual learning. Many of their local mutual aid communities credit their inspiration to the work of Reagan De Logans. De Logans is an indigenous community organizer, art historian, curator, and educator who lives on Canarsie land in Lenapehoking, often called Brooklyn, New York. I reference De Logans with caution, aware that their understanding of mutual aid is a family resemblance to Anabaptist practice, but also that their work has critiqued the ways that mutual aid is often co-opted by those who do not want to do the hard work of changing the hierarchies of power and white saviorism that is inherent to charity. Instead, De Logans argues that people want to practice charity, but call it something else. What makes this an act of co-option rather than solidarity is the lack of a necessary long-term commitment to a community and the refusal to reduce the dignity of any persons. De Logans writes, "We cannot allow mutual aid practices to be co-opted by nonprofits, white organizers, or other charity-based folks who are not committed to understanding that mutual aid has been a practice by people of color for longer than they could even imagine. Mutual aid is a unifying term, putting a name to the practice that most of us Black, Indigenous, people of color folks have been acting on all our lives. Yes, it has been used in times of crises to help the most targeted in our society so that they can survive, but that is not enough. We must be committed to seeing people thrive, not just scrape by." In a way that may resonate with the historic Anabaptist suspicion of the state, a privileged suspicion which has often been intentionally ignorant of the racially different experiences of such critiques, De Logans writes further, and I need to mention that this quote is in all capital letters, "It is a long-term commitment based in actionable results that removes community out of their dependency on the capitalist settler state." Here we see something that Fretz assumes in his descriptions of mutual aid, but does not make as forcefully explicit. Mutual aid requires long-term relationship and commitment. Fretz holds that understanding through his idea of mutual aid as part of a commitment of membership in an Anabaptist community, but he does not make explicit the importance of long-term commitment. I think that is because his social location has not been betrayed constantly by treaties ignored, promises broken, genocides repeated. Fretz sees mutual aid through the safety of a predominantly white Anabaptist community that is operating less out of the need for survival, although that has been part of the Anabaptist story, but more from the ideal of living into a certain understanding of theology and ethics. And so Fretz, unlike De Logans, can look at mutual aid with perhaps a naive hope, unaware of the risk and steely resolve needed to see it come to fruition. These mutual aid communities that are a part of Mutual Aid New York City have adopted a charter with 9 principles, which I think are important enough to share. It would be interesting to compare these principles with the principles that MCC operates with, not as equivalencies, but to see what the overlap and difference might be. 1, our responsibility as a community is to ensure that all people have what they need to, I will read that again. Our responsibility as a community is to ensure that all people have what they need to thrive, and we believe that all people have something to contribute. 2, we share power, we do not hoard it. 3, we partner, we do not dominate. 4, we build in public. 5, we do not share information in ways that we know will harm. 6, we are anti-racist. 7, we prioritize people over profit. 8, we meet people where they are. And 9, we commit to being accountable for the impact of our actions while assuming good intent. We recognize that at all times we will fall short and ask our community to support us by holding us accountable. While I'm sure it has been mentioned sufficiently already, I cannot emphasize enough that those practicing mutual aid must attend to 2 core concerns constantly. That mutual aid is about long-term commitment to a community, and that it is about solidarity and the dignity of all persons, not charity. That this is repeated so often across many different mutual aid organizations, I think reflects 2 underlying beliefs that those of us who have been raised in capitalist cultures have been taught repeatedly. First, that people should be mobile and not worry about uprooting themselves from the communities they were raised in. A tangential but related capitalist practice is the gentrifying of communities that forcibly removes people from the sorts of communities that can practice mutual aid. This capitalist practice can be seen as an act of destruction against the long-term relationships that can build this alternative economics. Second, that there are hierarchies of value of human life, which is made painfully obvious every day by who is cared for and who is forgotten. Even the very fundamental assumption that compensation should be different between different kinds of labor holds a fundamental assumption that humans can have different amounts of worth. It can also subtly shape psychological and sociological assumptions of human dignity and human worth. On that rather somber note, I'd like to turn to consider how the practices of mutual aid and the work of the Mennonite Central Committee might be moving in the same direction towards solving similar problems with related values. The Mennonite Central Committee has always been supportive of mutual aid. It helped publish many of the pamphlets on mutual aid written by Anabaptists in the mid-1900s, such as the one by J. Winfield Fretz. These pamphlets were eventually organized into a compendium on mutual aid, which the MCC also helped fund, entitled The Compassionate Community. In addition, MCC was critical in the creation and support of the Association of Mennonite Aid Societies. One spot on the board of the association was held for an MCC representative. Over time, as noted prior, these mutual aid societies have ceased to exist, although some Anabaptist communities have been trying to recreate them in limited ways. What then is it for an organization like MCC, which runs significantly on charitable donations, to think about its relationship to mutual aid? Especially as I have been at pains to remind us that charity and mutual aid are not only different, but that some people argue that they are mutually exclusive. I would like to tentatively suggest that the goals of MCC overlap with the concerns of doing those mutual aid work. For mutual aid is always about more just and more robust forms of sharing power. Why also has the MCC moved away from mutual aid towards practices of development? One possible suggestion is that the interest by Anabaptists in mutual aid has waned. One can ask a self-reflective question of Anabaptists to get at this. Do you trust your community to care for you until death? Or do you have retirement accounts that you hope will be able to fund your care until you die? And if Anabaptists no longer trust their communities to care for them until death, then how could they ask others of the same thing? Instead, Anabaptists predominantly have come to trust a mixture of government and privately funded retirements. These practices, while not necessarily resistant to mutual aid, certainly make it difficult because the loci of trust is not in the communal relationships, but in governmental and financial instruments. And yet, as many of you may be thinking, and as I also think, I do not know what it would look like to trust my community instead of using these other tools which are embedded in our economics and society. I think this is akin to MCC's commitment to relief, development, and peace in the name of Christ. Relief and development are indeed at times necessary, but they do not necessarily build towards the systemic and structural changes that might end the need for relief and development. To be clear, development does not have to mean encouraging communities to care for themselves by finding ways to participate in global capitalism, but it often does. It could be the case that development means helping to support local communities of mutual aid, but even that would need to be wary of the challenge to relationship and the attitude of charity inherent to white saviorism and disguised forms of settler colonialism. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. If assuming, Kevin, that you have got your material ready, yes, perfect. I'm going to ask you to present to us now.
Okay, thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Eric, for that wonderful paper. So I do have some slides. I think a lot about objects and commodities and material culture. So I want to talk with pictures. And let's see, I think my paper shouldn't, okay, there we go, cool. So as you may have heard at the beginning of the panel, I had a small syncing issue with my attempts to use cloud technology for my paper. And so, yeah, last night I added a little more nuance and some stuff to my paper that was meant to provide a disclaimer, and then that is not showing up in the paper I have on this device. So that's okay. But so before I start, I just want to say, as you might have noticed from the title of my paper, you know, starting to think about More with Less Cookbook and 10,000 Villages as these things that are linked to kind of neoliberal thinking or neoliberal identity, I am seeking to develop a critique here of these two programs. And so I just want to say as a disclaimer, like I'm aware that I'm at a 100th anniversary celebration in many ways, and that there are probably a lot of really positive comments to be made. And I am a big fan of the MCC, but I am ultimately a historian who is working more broadly on the way that many of these relief and development efforts from Christian churches in general in the 1970s were sort of captured by or limited by capitalism, and that kind of new formations of capitalism that were emerging under the name neoliberalism sort of, I keep finding in the archive ways that sort of limited or constrained or shaped what people were able to imagine, what kinds of efforts people were able to develop. So that's the critique I'm going to develop here. It's part of a larger project. And I have a lot of admiration for the way MCC has looked at the modern nation state and its violence and the violent effects of colonialism and sought to intervene. But for the rest of my time, I'm trying to think with you about ways that intervention has still been shaped or limited by neoliberal logics. So I'm going to jump in. So I want you to join me in picturing some wooden serving bowls. They're unvarnished so that they show the marks of their handmade production and feel simple and rustic to the touch of their buyers. They're advertised in a catalog of fair trade products from Haiti throughout the 70s. And the bowl and other hand-carved wooden crafts appear alongside images of rustic and simple, yet content and joyous Haitian life, promising in some sense to transmit these constructed qualities of true Haitianness to the affluent white consumers who would buy them in religious gift shops and congregational Christmas bazaars across the United States and Canada. Only a few years earlier, the Mennonite Central Committee's American Director of Rural Development had helped curate and cultivate these commodities of Haitian authenticity by pushing for greater production of wooden crafts there, citing his sense that the needlework many Haitians had been producing was not sufficiently distinct from the MCC's other needlework. As he jotted on the top of a memo sent to the 10,000 Villages director at the time, quote, "I'm discouraging needlework because I know you have good sources already. So in Haiti, it's wood, and I'm still hoping we can get Paraguay cracking on leather, and Brazil will need to do better than what I saw. Let's help them find it." So more on Paraguay and Brazil a bit later, but for now, back to these wooden bowls. Produced by Haitian workers and shipped to a holiday sale at some Christian church somewhere in the US, these bowls wind up wrapped and under Christmas trees in middle-class homes, serving as focal objects in a ritual of gift giving that, in their use of fair trade, seek to contest the overconsumption of affluent America on its high holy day. Soon, these bowls appear on dining tables, perhaps now filled with some recipe drawn from the More with Less Cookbook, a guide for globally responsible eating published by the MCC in the mid-1970s, and often shelved next to fair trade gifts at 10,000 Villages stores. This moment of consumption is invested with conceptions of how the self, how God, how the world might responsibly relate to one another in an era of global trade. Consuming these foods drawn from African, Latin American, and Asian diets, served in handcrafted objects like Haitian wooden bowls, fair trade consumers seek out a religious relationship within global supply chains at the site of their bodies, invoking a simultaneously spiritual and material connection to Haitian producers. So in the words of one regional director of MCC Fair Trade Sales in 1969, quote, "The hand-carved salad bowl on your table not only adds elegance to your dining room, but it also links you with the destitute woodcarver in Haiti who has carefully fashioned it," end quote. Invoking this link, fair trade consumers fashion themselves as globally responsible, undertaking an act of religious and racial formation that might free their whiteness of the weight of affluent overconsumption, while through the magic of markets and capital flows, linking themselves and hopefully transforming the lives of people on the other side of the world. So in these glimpses of religion and economy created through MCC projects like the 1976 More with Less Cookbook and 10,000 Villages, which was founded right after World War II, but came into its own really in the late 60s and 70s, we can see two sites at either end of a global supply chain in which capital, commodities, and white Christian hopes for the world flow coterminously. In this network, Notions of Christian responsibility, American whiteness, and the global South's inherent cultural authenticity are constructed in relation to one another, forming new linkages in the dawning era of decolonized free trade, with an American economic empire serving as its hegemon. Looking at these sites of religious and racial formation, I argue that fair trade consumption, both in the form of 10,000 villages and more with less, served middle-class white Protestants with material objects that could be deployed in rituals of purification, through which the encumbrances of their whiteness might be lifted, whiteness attached in their minds to an affluence whose connections to global problems were newly visible through their encounters with ecological and economic scarcity in the early 70s. So these consumptive rituals in which white Protestants hoped to lift the encumbrances of overconsumption from their bodies, they hinge on moments of racial and cultural formation at the other end of the supply chain, at sites of production through which producers and production were disciplined to mobilize an authentic Haitianness, always at least in part curated and constructed by white American stakeholders. Okay, so the next section is a historical overview of the cookbook and 10,000 Villages, and I think for time, I'm going to skip it because I'm guessing that many of you are familiar with these. And I'll say I'm aware that of course, 10,000 Villages is a new name, and the program has undergone many name changes. And for most of the time in the 70s, when I'm discussing it, it was called Self-Help Crafts. And so for simplicity, I'm just saying 10,000 Villages throughout the paper. Okay, so returning to the supply chain, looking first to sites of production organized throughout the world by 10,000 Villages staff. We can see that 10,000 Villages staff made contact and connected producers with fair trade consumers at these sites of production. And we see that in addition to a basic desire to develop forms of exchange that could support the financial well-being of these destitute Haitian woodcarvers and other producers around the world, we see also that another core task of these relief workers involved identifying and curating specific objects that could manifest global South cultural authenticity to consumers. So again, thinking back to that quote that, we have a lot of needlework, so we're gonna get the Haitians to carve wood, we're gonna get the Paraguayans to make leather. I don't end up talking about Brazil in this paper that much, but there's an interesting case there where the needlework they had been making for years wasn't distinctively Brazilian enough, and there were some suggestions of developing a product with banana leaf backing on it, like tablecloths or something like that, that would sort of scream authentically Brazilian to consumers. So there's this trend of kind of the MCC workers sort of helping construct some kind of sort of cultural authenticity for the producers, which then plays a big role in the catalogs and how these things are advertised. So yeah, as staffers searched for new products to sell in their fair trade shops, they often revealed a deep investment in the presentation of global South racial and ethnic identities as traditional, exotic, distinctive, and dignified, while positioning themselves explicitly as the stakeholders with the most know-how and expertise on how to recover and sustain those culturally authentic identities. So in order to help rediscover this cultural heritage, American managers of 10,000 Villages often rejected items that craftspeople had been making for years because they did not immediately jump out to program staff as uniquely Haitian or uniquely Israeli or uniquely Indian to consumers. So for example, after rejecting crafts submitted by Paraguayan craftspeople as not sufficiently unique, Pennsylvania MCC staffers suggested leatherworking. Paraguayan agricultural workers had experience with leatherwork for making saddles and other agricultural implements, and perhaps this could be deployed to link Paraguayan ways of life with fair trade commodities. But as 10,000 Villages staff put it, quote, aside from the farm equipment, an urgent requirement was to inject other forms of leather products for sale. A feeling for being able to make something nice needed to be developed. end quote. So to aid with this, staff sent the MCC worker in Paraguay a catalog, an American catalog with examples of various leather designs that were being produced by American companies. And then the Paraguayan craftspeople began producing wallets, belts, Bible covers, and more based on American designs. And then these pieces were made available as these kind of uniquely Paraguayan objects that uniquely reflected their authentic lives in South America. So let's see, skipping ahead, returning to Haiti, as MCC workers sought to manage the production of the wooden bowls we began with, they often complained that actual Haitian culture, as they experienced it up close and personal, was anything but simple and content. The kinds of simplicity they saw among their Haitian workers were often viewed as a problem or an obstacle. So one MCC worker wrote in 1977, quote, "Haitians do not understand why things must be straight, why they may not be cracked or have holes in them. They don't understand the loaded shelves at home, competing with other products for the buyer's dollar. Haitians use things no matter how cracked or crooked they are. Nothing gets thrown away, it's used for something." But here we get this picture of like real simplicity and trying to reduce waste and trying to make use of whatever gets made. And it actually exists there, and it needs to be disciplined into the handcrafted excellence expected of fair trade consumers. So to transmit this constructed sense of authenticity and simplicity. So in the minds of fair trade managers, these realities verified the need. Sorry, I'm just checking the chat. Yeah, I just, I like to have an image up that's kind of what I'm talking about, but I don't have a ton of slides, no. Okay, so this quotation, let's see, so where am I? In the minds of fair trade managers, these realities verified the need for American expertise in curating the actually authentic, the actually virtuous simplicity, leaving to one side those aspects of an indigenous culture that don't fit the mold. As one MCC staffer observed, the Haitian production co-op is, quote, "operating in somewhat typical Haitian fashion and has become somewhat corrupt and exploitive. It seems to us that MCC had been helping to Haitianize an American institution, and it instead is becoming Haitian throughout, including business practices and decisions which seem so typical of the general Haitian culture," end quote. So this quotation, perhaps more than any other in the archive, suggests this tension I've been discussing, a real desire to kind of reduce the worst, most violent effects of kind of post-World War II racial capitalism, but at the same time, a desire to kind of discipline the cultures in which they're working, viewing this as this problem where the production co-op is, quote, "becoming Haitian throughout." Yeah, quote, "It seems to us that MCC had been helping to Haitianize an American institution and it's instead becoming Haitian throughout," end quote. So I have a hard time parsing that, but it seems ultimately to point to this basic desire to construct a consumer-friendly Haitian authenticity over against the complex realities that exist within any culture or society that, along with the range of other goods available in 10,000 villages and serve stores, serve is another kind of similar fair trade program. These transmit values of simplicity and virtue linked to notions of cultural authenticity for the sake of embodied religious and racial formation at sites of American consumption. One last thing from this one production site in Haiti, in a 1977 letter, one MCC worker was even more direct and candid. She expressed her frustration that, quote, "some employed men in Haiti use the money to acquire status for themselves in the community by buying cool clothes," end quote. So I sense here in this kind of reaction against this frustration with the craftspeople's desire to purchase cool clothes, to acquire status in their community, a desire to kind of maintain or discipline these communities into fitting this picturesque kind of simple life among Haitian craftspeople that is so central, as you can see on the slide here, to the way these goods are marketed. Worrying that cool clothes or status symbols will problematize that picture of Haitian workers that were so central. Turning then finally to sites of consumption at our other end of the supply chain, one can imagine yeah, sorry, I'm trying to keep my eye on like the chat for time warnings, but then seeing other messages and getting sidetracked. So sorry about that. So it's turning finally to these sites of consumption at the other end of the supply chain. Yeah, one can imagine these products winding up in the homes and upon the tables of American consumers who were in search of objects that might help them in their goal of embodying forms of global responsibility in light of their personal connections to these shifting capitalist formations in the 70s. So this theme of embodied transformation for affluent white Christians was developed most influentially within the MCC's More with Less Cookbook, whose 1976 publication coincided with the rapid growth of 10,000 Villages, constituting in many ways a sister project of 10,000 Villages. So the cookbook's always stocked on the shelves of 10,000 Villages stores. It was published around the same time that 10,000 Villages was kind of flourishing and establishing brick and mortar stores and distributing catalogs. And its recipes and guidelines outline dietary practices through which its users might manage the link between their bodies and the networks of exchange that connect them with the global economy, all while purifying their own embodied state. So the cookbook articulated a spirituality of mutual transformation as both first world consumer and third world producer could be lifted out of the malaises of affluent overconsumption and impoverished underconsumption, respectively. In the front matter of the cookbook, its compiler, Doris Jansen Longacre, explicitly articulated these themes of racialized embodiment by discussing technologies of bodily transformation in relation to the spiritual crisis of American affluence and the inherent virtue of simple rustic lifestyles in the global South. So directed squarely at capitalism's global network of interconnection in hopes of transforming the lives of both third world poor and first world affluent, as they would have been called at the time, the spirituality of More with Less connected middle-class American practitioners with God, God's people, and God's purposes through those same economic channels. American consumption in a globalized economy was affecting the souls of the interconnected masses on both sides of the divide. The task of 10,000 Villages in the More with Less cookbook was to leverage that formation toward holy ends. So hoping to avoid the stereotypical fly in the eyes photos of missions advertisements, Longacre carefully selected images that might point instead to her message of mutual transformation. So in one photograph, a child, I'm not sure if she's from Africa or Afro-Caribbean or from South America, but a child presumably from the global South gazes at the viewer with a look of pleasure and contentment. Her rustic straw hat and dress, as well as the simple meal set upon her humble wooden table, indicate simplicity, but there are no signs of despair or lack. Here, simplicity is a virtue rather than a problem to be solved. The child's intimate, immediate gaze invites the viewer to embrace rather than evade this virtue. And the caption of the image reads, quote, "One who is full tramples on virgin honey, but to the man who is hungry, any bitter thing is sweet," suggesting that by always eating their fill, Americans are prone to foolishness and waste, while those who live with hunger possess an extra measure of wisdom and contentment. So through what I understand is a very racialized gaze, the text imagines a kind of refined whiteness, freed from the encumbrances of over-civilization through consumption of foods that made Black and brown bodies virtuous in their simplicity. And finally, for Longacre, the potential for this interconnected transformation, as expressed in More with Less, was most tangible and direct in the shape of actual bodies. So this is a cookbook, so of course it's about bodies, and through this embodied register, the disparity between American lifestyles and those of the third world was at its most tangible. After returning from their MCC placement in Vietnam, Longacre observed, quote, "People here looked cumbersome, ungainly, plodding. We missed the lithe grace of the Asians," end quote. So like American spiritual practitioners who embrace yoga, the transformation of their bodies could be a spiritual act which tangibly connected themselves to a religious cause, a connection that flowed through global capitalism. I eat less meat, and thanks to the market, there's more grain elsewhere, there's more resources elsewhere. And thanks to this connection, my body is transformed to become lithe and graceful in the same way that bodies produced by poverty appear to me. So especially these quotes about sort of missing the lithe grace of the Asians and more with less, or not wanting Haitian craftspeople to buy cool clothes or status symbols. I see this kind of desire to, so I'm closing now, this is my last sentence. So I'm seeing this desire to create these global supply chains or networks of exchange that can produce embodied spiritual transformation for white North American consumers, but in some ways requiring or expecting the people in the global South to stay in their place in some ways, like don't buy cool clothes, don't gain weight, continue living these simple rustic lives that are so important to our vision of spiritual transformation. So yeah, I am out of time. So thank you all, and I will really look forward to any conversation we can have afterwards. So thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm going to ask Robert Suderman to give us his presentation at this point, please.
Yes, good morning. It's very good to be with you this morning. I am sitting here in Winnipeg, even though our home is in New Hamburg, Ontario at the moment. The title of my paper focuses well the theme of my talk, MCC and the Church, a continuing saga of ambiguity. I am aware of course, that MCC's identity as a churchly organization or an ecclesial project has come under close scrutiny and can be quite controversial. All the more reason to take a look at this one more time. At the beginning of the wineskins process in 2008, in their paper outlining the purpose of the project, Bert Loby and Mark Chuck posed two key questions. To whom is MCC accountable? Who is the keeper of the MCC soul? I appreciate the way they stated it, because an ecclesial identity or a churchly identity has more to do with soul than with structure and organization. And one can sense the presence of soul even when structures and programming are failing or flailing. And one can also sense the absence of soul even when structures and programs seem to be working well. The concluding document of the wineskins process answers the questions that it began by asking. These questions, it answers them in a remarkably clear way. The document begins by saying that MCC is a worldwide ministry of Anabaptist churches. It says more, but I want to stop here for a moment. MCC, it says, is a ministry of the churches. Later on in the process, the wineskins process clarified what it meant with churches here. I won't go into that at this point. In other words, at the core of MCC's identity is the church. MCC is an ecclesial body. It has an ecclesial identity, and at its core, it has an ecclesial vocation. This is what wineskins defines quite clearly. The tiny word of is powerful. It's a preposition. It can mean at least three different things. Of can mean origin, it can mean essence, and it can mean belonging. And I suspect that in the wineskins process, the wineskins document, it intends to mean all three things. MCC has its origins in the church. It belongs in and to the churches, and its ministry is the essence of the presence of the church in the world. In brief, MCC is not a freestanding organization. With its own identity and ministry. MCC is an instrument, it is a tool, it is an arm of and for the ministry of the church. Or we could say that MCC is the church in action. It has an ecclesial identity, and its core is an ecclesial vocation. I want to fully acknowledge here the complexity of what is being said in this document. This affirmation is not easy. It brings into full focus immediately for all of us the reality of the church in the world. And I would say the fallen reality of the church in the world. The fear is that this kind of definition inevitably will make MCC into a lowest common denominator agency, because the supporting or sponsoring churches cannot agree on a lot of things. I understand that. I have lived that personally in my own flesh, and I have the same fear. But that is not what I'm talking about here. The hope of the wineskins document, the hope of the wineskins definition, is that we can help each other to move toward the highest common denominator in terms of what it means to be the church. And when we understand more fully what that is, it really kind of is mind-blowing. I have outlined this sense of highest common denominator, ecclesially speaking, elsewhere in various papers and some books, and I will not mention it here. Although I did present a paper to MCC in 2006, which was requested, and in that paper, I do go much more in greater detail into what this means as a higher common denominator church. But I want to acknowledge the presence of the lowest common denominator. The complexities are great. The complexities of diversity generate limitations and often what feels like obstructions. The difficulty of language and how do we speak about this. And we see language shifting very soon after the wineskins definition. For example, in the year 2014, MCC published a brochure. They republished it in 2018. And this brochure is entitled MCC and the Church, Together in Mission. And I just want us to notice this shift from of the church to and the church. And means neither origin, nor belonging, nor essence. It is a conjunction, grammatically speaking, that links two equal parties together, church and MCC. This shift of to and moves us beyond the ambiguity of language into the ambivalence of the soul. Ambiguity is simply a lack of clarity. Ambivalence is a lack of certainty. And we attempt to clarify ambiguity by asking, who are we? but ambivalence knows who we are, but is not sure that is what we want to be. The issue in ambivalence is not clarity, it is doubt or uncertainty. This kind of difficulty of language is, I'm sorry, to be sure the profound nature of the ecclesial of that is referred to in the wineskins document is largely silent in the founding documents of the MCC. When we search for clarity regarding the MCC church relationships in the founding documents and processes, we are met mostly by silence. Robert Kreider, in his masterful speech at the 75th anniversary of MCC, states, quote, "I have found no energizing vision statement at the birth of Mennonite Central Committee. The birth was so ordinary." This silence continues. This silence of articulated ecclesial connections continues well into the 1920s, the 1930s, the 40s, the 50s, and even into the 60s, right up at least till the formation of Mennonite of MCC Canada. There is a lot of noise, to be sure. There's noise regarding governance and location and name and many other things. But there is relative silence in terms of significant articulation, significantly articulating an ecclesial identity. And this silence is an assumption. It is not an omission, I believe. The silence that we find in these decades is the silence of articulated ecclesiology. It is a deafening silence because it understates the assumptions of ecclesiology that permeate the entire enterprise. However, I think this silence constitutes one of the most powerful ecclesial voices in the relationship between MCC and the church. In other words, the silence indicates that it is something that can be assumed. It does not need to be explained. More and more, the and replaces the of. The two entities become independent entities, each on either side of the conjunction and. Arlie Clausen, for example, summarizes well in the final chapter of Table of Sharing in 2011. She states, for example, that the MCC system itself, I quote, has evolved into multiple governance structures where each entity has begun defining MCC for itself. MCC has needed to protect and clarify its mandate. I think this is an indication again of the ambiguity of the of as compared to the and. Another document I point to in my paper is a document written by John Siebert in 2015 in an evaluation he did for the question of advocacy in the MCC world. I will not go into detail here, simply to say that Siebert proposes a major shift in MCC's vocational goal for the 21st century. It is striking that this proposed elaboration or this proposed shift that he elaborates is done without any significant thought, I think, of how this could be perceived from an ecclesial perspective. Again, what we notice in his proposal, in his paper, is silence, ecclesial silence. But this time, it is not a silence of an assumption. It is the silence of omission. And this is indeed a different kind of silence. It is not the same. I want to also say a few words about the MCC slogan or motto, in the name of Christ. In spite of what we have identified above as ambiguity and ambivalence of ecclesial identity, and within ecclesial diversity, there has been a surprising consensus on at least one piece of MCC's ecclesial identity. For the last 75 years or so, the Mennonite and Anabaptist world has been able to rally around and sustain a core agreement around the motto, in the name of Christ. Robert Kreider calls this the Christological core of MCC. And he says that this Christological core is expressed with biblical simplicity. He attributes this motto to an MCC worker at London during the Second World War. His name is John Kaufman. And this is surely laudable. This motto has done what ecclesial stress has not been able to do. Namely, it has successfully invited ecclesial diversity into sustained ministry partnership. It is striking, however, that Kreider and others identifies this as the Christological core of MCC. I'd like to suggest a small shift in that. I don't think that in the name of Christ is fundamentally a Christological statement. It too is an ecclesiological statement. It expresses the ways in the foundational ways in which the nature and the being of the church in the world should function. It describes succinctly how the church is to function, not how we understand the nature of Christ. I suspect that in the 1940s, it was no more possible to separate Christology from ecclesiology than it was to separate ecclesiology from missiology. These were one package, and Kreider's identifying it as a Christological motto. I think we should update that in some way. If we are to take his suggestion that the motto in the name of Christ is biblical simplicity, then there is no doubt that it is a statement about the being and the active activity of the church in the world. This motto, this phrase, in the name of Christ, I find it at least 12 times in the New Testament. And each time it is used, it talks about the activity and the life of the church in the world. It refers to baptism and healing and exorcism and unity and love for one another and being a living testimony of the body of Christ. In light of what we have discussed above, I think it is critically important to restore this phrase back to its ecclesiological intent, because not to do so again strips MCC of its churchly presence, and it strips the church of its ongoing need to know Christ by following him in life. So in conclusion, let me just make a few comments. The struggle to define MCC and the church continues. The struggle centers around two key components, I think. One is that we need to know what we mean, and the other is we need to say clearly what we know. It should be evident by now that the ecclesial soul of MCC will need to be intentionally and deliberately nurtured and even protected. It will not survive casual care of busy staff, of overloaded agendas, of denominational failing and sometimes flailing. It is perhaps time, I would suggest, that as we move into the 21st century, that the denominational and MCC structures employ what I would call an ecclesial ombudsperson or a watchdog to care for and to nurture the ecclesial soul of MCC. I'm convinced that paying more attention to the ecclesial foundations and how communication and accountability work will be equally helpful to MCC and to the participating churches. I think it would inject added meaning and purpose to both. Paying more attention to a difficult area of accountability will strengthen the sense of ownership of diverse denominations, but it will also generate additional channels of interdenominational conversation. And it will give to MCC an increased sense of ecclesial identity and purpose. And these, it seems to me, would be priceless gifts for the 100th anniversary of MCC, that to both MCC and the churches. And we will need these gifts to engage a second century of ministry in the name of Christ. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. I will just say that I already have one question here collected in chat, but to everybody who is listening, and several questions in the question and answer box as well. I'll move through those in the order that I have received them. And I'm assuming also that the question and answer visible to the presenters or just to me?
Yeah, they can see it as well.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Okay, so the first question that I received is one that came up in chat from Patrick Obande. I'm assuming, but I'm not sure, that this is a question primarily for Robert. How do we embody Christian Anabaptist authenticity and accountability to the convictional community when ambiguity is deliberately built into MCC's operations?
Ambiguity is also the nature of the life of the church. So MCC is not the only organization that experiences ambiguity and ambivalence in its own identity. That also is true for the church. Together, we work at that. We work at what that means for each other. I think that's kind of the best thing I can say. It's a joint project. We commit to each other to work at this together.
Okay, our next question I think is directed to Eric. I will just, it's possibly more of a comment than a question, but let Eric respond to it. I'll just read it out here. Thanks for your work about Winfield Fretz's mutual aid research. As a fundraiser, I have maintained, this is from Fred Martin, by the way, as a fundraiser, I have maintained that philanthropy is a functional part of mutual aid, i.e. a charitable love of humanity in our 21st century capitalist economy. We are no longer isolated agricultural communities that build each other's barns. Charitable organizations like MCC do this work on our behalf with our cash. I think the founding president of Conrad Grebel would agree that donors are generally acting out their faith. Did you want to respond to that, Eric?
Yeah, I can say a little bit. First, Fred, thanks for the comment. I actually had run into a paper of yours online, and I almost cited it and used it to sort of think with you about some of that, because I think the way that you're organizing it, at least in the paper I saw, was that mutual aid is subsumed under this idea of philanthropy. And I think within 21st capitalist economies, that's almost the only choice that we have. I don't think it's surprising that as Anabaptists have moved off the farm, mutual aid becomes less possible. That being creative and thinking through ways of doing mutual aid is much harder when we have specialized jobs. You know, I can't jump in and do your job if you break your leg, right? But if you're a farmer and I'm a farmer, I can jump in and work a little bit harder and plow your field. So I think you're right. The other thing I want to say is I don't think charity, philanthropy, and insurance and things like that, I don't think those are bad things. I think those are really good things, but I think they're different than mutual aid. That mutual aid is something about tying one's fate together with someone else in ways that are very difficult in capitalist economics. And so I even wonder if it's possible to really practice mutual aid and practice capitalism at the same time. I get a little, I don't know, I go back and forth on that a lot there. So I think there's a lot still to think about for what does it mean at present to try to move towards mutual aid while living in a society that does not value it. But things like corporate governance, things like wage inequality, wealth inequality, right? All of these are aspects to this much larger problem.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from Doreen Clausen, and it's directed to Kevin. She comments, lovely exploration of the concept of authenticity. Her question, how does authenticity in so-called self-help organizations compare with concerns about authenticity in tourist crafts?
Yeah, thank you. That's a lovely question, and I appreciate your engagement with what I was speaking about. I think the first thing I'll say is that I don't study tourist crafts very closely, and that my work in general is focused on kind of how white North American Christians have sort of used consumer practices to deal with their concerns about the planet or about the sort of post-war world. And so so I can't speak to the production of tourist objects in the same way I can fair trade objects, but my sense is that cultural authenticity is probably as important in the production and in the way that these things are constructed and framed in like tourist gift shops. And I would guess that it's as sort of like you could poke holes in it in a similar way that I have with the fair trade objects. But I think that the difference for me, or the comparison between the two, would be that tourist crafts aren't as focused on the way it will transform the life of the consumer in the way that fair trade crafts get framed. And like the fair trade crafts I've looked at, and especially in like 10,000 Villages marketing material, is kind of all about, if I could just, let's see, I'm going to throw this up because I think this image is fascinating. It's all about posing the consumer and the producer together and sort of making them parallel and showing the way that the global exchange or the supply chain links them and builds a transformative relationship between them. And what I think is central is that there's this promise that the authenticity of the fair trade craft will produce authenticity in you, the consumer. You will have an authentic kind of experience of transformation and connection and relationship that you miss out on in today's like high-tech consumer culture or social media or mass media environment. So that's what I think is the biggest difference in my mind, is that the fair trade consumption is so charged with meaning about how it will provide authenticity for the consumer in a way that a tourist souvenir might not be charged with that same meaning. So thanks again for that question.
Okay, our next question is directed to Jack, Robert. From Daryl Lowen. In 2007, Mennonite Schools Council, today, and as I understand the brackets there, the title today is US Mennonite Schools Council, published a nationwide consultant study of Mennonite schools in the church. Broadly stated, it revealed a church constituency of which one half cared deeply for the schools, while the other half cared nothing for their well-being or existence. Canadian Mennonite school administrators resonated with the report. So the question, is MCC's of the church much different than this? To which parts of the churches is MCC to be?
Yes, thank you, Daryl. I appreciate that question. A simple answer is that it is not much different. I think what I'm exploring here in terms of agencies or organizations of the church can also be applied to other agencies of the church, whether they are schools, colleges, universities, or credit unions, or whatever else claims to be of the church. So I think there's definitely a linkage there. It's a very common agenda that we have all together. I think the other thing that is common that we all share is what I refer to as the lowest common denominator view of the church. We immediately gravitate to the mistakes, the sins of the church throughout history, not only today, but throughout history. And how can we be connected to that? How can MCC be connected to that? Or how can a college be connected to that? And yet this is what the definition became after a 2-year, very intense, very costly process of consultation globally around the world during the wineskins process. The definition is not mine. The definition is that of the people that were consulted, that MCC is a ministry of the church. It goes on to, the wineskins process goes on to explain, to make a distinction between churches in general, which was not good enough for the folks, especially the international voices as I experienced them, just to speak generically of the church or the Anabaptist church. They wanted to ground that in specific churches. And so the question was defined, and the accountability of MCC specifically is to sponsoring denominations in North America. And that was defined in Hillsborough, Kansas, at one of the summit meetings that they had in the wineskins there. So it's not generically global. It is not generically kind of all-inclusive in terms of that. The ministry is global. The ministry is around the world, but the accountability and the ownership, if you wish, the essence can be located in particular geographic, political, social milieu, which is North America. So wineskins made sure that we understand that.
Okay. The next question that I have is from Ellen F. Weaver. It's a question directed at Kevin. From your research in MCC archives, did you find any evidence of MCC workers reflecting on the irony or tensions in seeking to construct and promote a sense of the cultural authenticity of fair trade products?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. That's a great question. And so I'll say that I did not see anyone in the archives. I did not see anyone in the archival materials reflecting on the irony. I did talk to Frank, and he communicated to me that people at MCC are aware of ironies like this. And so I think, honestly, one of the reasons I didn't see it in the archive is just because this kind of thing doesn't show up in the archive that often. And you pine after these little like handwritten notes on the top of a memo or something where maybe the irony will show up, but you just don't see these things. I suspect that people were very aware of the irony, and I can say that, you know, the other side of the coin for me in thinking about how these projects were sort of limited or shaped by sort of neoliberal logics is this thing that I kind of only hinted at in the paper, which is the belief in kind of the magic of the free market to create these connections and to facilitate these transformations. And I will say that in With More with Less, which certainly has this message or this implication, it's like I eat less meat, and thanks to global markets, there's more grain somewhere else. I will say that Doris Longacre and her correspondents were aware of some irony there of like, this really kind of relies on this kind of capitalist thinking that we're actually not so sure we believe, but we do know that this is at least going to help people have more money to donate to relief and development efforts and donate to MCC. So at the very least, it'll make a change in that way. So there, on the More with Less side of things, there is some evidence in the archive of some like No, we're actually a little ambivalent about some of this stuff about the magic of the market, but we still think it's worth doing. So yeah, it's there. I think it's probably was there even more over like a water cooler or a cup of coffee than what I can find in the archive. So thanks for that question.
Okay, I am going to take the liberty as chair here of combining two questions. There are several questions coming up in chat as well as in the question and answer section. One question is from Bernard Thiessen, the other from Douglas Enns. Both of them concern the relationship of Mennonite Central Committee as a largely North American focused body to the European Mennonite churches. Everybody, I believe, can see Bernard Thiessen's comments in the chat, where he talks about experience with MCC work in Berlin after World War II and the complications of that, including the issues of how Mennonite Central Committee assistance could or could not be identified in Eastern Europe. And Douglas Enz's, and both of these, by the way, are directed to Robert. So I'll read Douglas Enz's comment and question, which I'm not sure is visible to everybody. In your mind, who is the church that MCC refers to? Only the Mennonite churches in North America or beyond? As we heard many times from European Mennonites, MCC functions as the church in mission and service for them. And I'll interject here that Bernard Thiessen raised the relationship in terms of MCC reflecting the church as its ecclesiological roots versus MCC as a, and I'm interjecting the word, active church building organization is where I see also some links between these comments. Your presentation helps explain why European Mennonites have difficulty understanding why MCC North America recently shut down the MCC West Europe office in Strasbourg, which continued an over 80-year expression of how the diverse European Mennonite church bodies work together in the name of Christ. So there, in both of these comments, there are reflections on the relationship between Mennonite Central Committee, North America, and the churches and the Mennonite Central Committee European office. If you care to respond briefly to that.
Yes, my response again has to do with the wineskins process. It's the way it functioned and it's what it intended to do. Two big questions were on the table. One is, should MCC be connected to the church at all? Is now the time to disconnect MCC from the church and become an independent agency of some kind? That was a big question. It was not assumed at the beginning of the process that question would be answered affirmatively. The second question was whether, if it were to be connected to the church, should it then assume a structure that would be globally accountable to the church, so that globally the Europeans and the Indonesians and the Africans and so on could be part of the governance and global accountability structure of MCC. Those are the two really big questions that were on the table. And in my experience with the wineskins process, there were many North American voices that spoke in terms of disconnecting MCC from the church. But once that discussion moved into the international and global circles, that the tsunami of opinion changed dramatically, that the voice was very clear that MCC was a church organization and should remain so. The second thing also from North America, it seemed like MCC North America should release its governance power over MCC and offer that to the global churches as well, so that the global churches would become owners in a real sense, or governance owners of MCC. And that was floated everywhere in the discussion. And again, when the discussion moved internationally away from North America, it was surprising to me to hear that the overwhelming sense of the voices was, no, we want MCC to stay as a North American organization. Don't pretend to be global, because you're not. You're not a global organization. It's better not to pretend to be that. You are a North American agency working globally, but you are not a global organization. And that idea came through loud and strong. And so when that was understood, then the question was, well, okay, so where particularly does accountability and the ownership and so on lie? And it's at that point when it was defined then that it would stay in North America, and it would stay with the denomination sponsoring MCC from North America, and they would not move into kind of an attempt at global accountability. Of course, there are substructures that make accountability of MCC programs in every country somehow accountable to that country and to some of the churches there. But the overall structure, it was clear that it should remain churchly and that it should remain North American, and that North Americans should not pretend to be global on this. And that included the Europeans. The Europeans quite strongly spoke also about that.
Okay, thank you. I have a question here, which I do not believe is, or I'm the only one who can see this question, but it's actually directed, it's in chat, directed to all three of the panelists. So I'm going to read the question. And before I do that, I'm just going to say, this is a question that comes from Esther Aptison. I'm going to ask Eric if he would like to respond first, since we haven't heard from him very much yet, and then Kevin, and then Robert. You don't have to respond to Esther's question, but if you would like to, that's the order that I'll call on you. So Esther writes, each of you has identified a major contradiction in MCC's practice and or identity. Indeed, much of this conference is about the contradictions between what MCC purports to aspire to and what MCC actually does. Here's the question. Are you hopeful that these contradictions can be overcome? Is this even possible? Eric, would you like to respond?
Yeah, that's a great question. In speaking with what I was thinking about with mutual aid and charity and all the complexity there, I don't think it's going to be resolved. And I'm also not sure it needs to be resolved. As uncomfortable as contradiction can be, I think can also be generative, and it can be a place of really beautiful alternative responses that come out because we sit in the discomfort and it then focuses attention on it, and then we can respond. I think I also sort of take a bit of a pragmatic turn that there is no pure purity out there of getting it all right or anything like that. So there always will be these sorts of contradictions out there, but I do really appreciate that question.
Kevin, any comments?
So, well, the first thing is just that, you know, anytime you ask a historian to make a prediction about the future, they're going to squirm a little. So I'll just say, I think that my research in general, what I found is that like efforts to do some kind of relief and development in reaction to the various sort of ecological and humanitarian crises of the 1970s and on have all had the same contradiction to them. That is this, we're embedded in capitalism, we're embedded in this neoliberal turn, and it shapes and limits what we can do and how we imagine acting. I see some hope in the fact that like today's, like the youth climate strike movement in particular is very sort of upfront about the idea that like we cannot accommodate capitalism, we cannot accommodate, in particular, we cannot accommodate this message that consumption is what is going to help us deal with climate change and things like that. Like when I go to the youth climate strike things on Fridays to support them. I hear that message over and over again, and I think that's awesome. And so I do think that I have some hope that some of these youth movements are going to start calling on relief and development efforts and calling on people who want to bring change in these ways to really take a more kind of oppositional stance and try to figure out how to stop accommodating some of these messages about like consumption and capitalism and how like we can operate within the channels to change them. So I have some hope there, but I think it's coming from the young people, which I'm grateful for.
Robert, any comments on Esther Aptison's question?
Well, it's a great question. Thank you. I'm not sure I would necessarily call it a contradiction. It's a tension that we live with all the time as a church and as church agencies. It's stress, areas of stress that we live in. But I think my sense is that if we cannot begin to come to common ground on what I call the highest common denominator in terms of the vision for the church in the world, as detailed in our scripture, there is not much hope for this, because the train is out of the station in a sense. And as long as we focus on the obstruction of being connected to the church, that will essentially carry the day. But if we can together begin to focus on the highest common denominator of what it means to be church and to be church together, I think we can survive this, and I think there's hope. But as I stated very briefly at the end, I think it has to be, we're at the stage where it has to be done intentionally and very deliberately, and it won't, we can't ride this much anymore.
Okay. The next question is in the question and answer box from Rick Bauman, and it's directed at Kevin. 10,000 Villages as a corporate entity closed in Canada just over a year ago. Its sales were not enough to pay its bills. On the other hand, the More with Less cookbook keeps selling. Do you have any comment on the different fortunes of these two MCC endeavors since you so fascinatingly tied them together?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a great question. I saw it a minute ago and I've been pondering it. And I think that there might be a really simple answer to that, which is that like specialty brick and mortar stores in general are not doing well because of the rise of e-commerce. And so there's just high overhead to have a shop. Like there's a 10,000 Villages in Charlottesville where I am, and it's on the downtown mall, which is the most expensive storefront space in the area. And so like, this is just a general economic trend that stores like that, if they're not doing like a high volume of sales, aren't going to survive. But then beyond that, I also think there are two things. One is that, as far as I'm concerned, doing research into various early fair trade programs, Edna Ruth Byler and the Mennonite Central Committee basically invented modern fair trade as we know it, with self-help crafts. And I mean, there's some antecedents in like antebellum America, like the free produce movement, but really it's the MCC project that really kickstarts modern fair trade. And then now it's like you can go to Kroger with, I guess that's like my regional grocery store. You can go to like a grocery store and there's fair trade options on shelves. So like, I also think that fair trade took off so well that it's just like so readily available that people are less likely to like go to a fair trade store because they can get fair trade in lots of places. And then finally, I think that the cookbooks have a climate change resonance that helps them continue to be successful. And I didn't talk about Simply in Season, but I see that everywhere I go. Like anytime I go to someone's house, Simply in Season seems to be on their shelf, which is the more environmentally themed follow-up to More with Less. But both of them, I think, because there is this continued clamoring for ways that people can change their consumer choices because of climate change, that the cookbooks continue to resonate in a way that maybe going to a specialty gift shop for fair trade goods might not. So yeah, those are my initial thoughts on that question. It's a great one. Thank you.
Okay, I have several comments and a few questions that are directed at Robert. Some are in question and answer, some are in chat, but only one of them, I'm sure one of them is visible to everybody, but not all of them. So I'm just going to read one that is a comment rather than a question, and then try and put the others together a little bit since I see some strong similarity. So this is a comment from Douglas Inns. Jack, on this question of MCC decentralizing North American power, Arlie Clausen recollects that the developing world did not want to assume the responsibility and burden of running MCC international offices, but Europe was not present at the table for this question. So that's a comment rather than a question. There are a couple of questions I'm going to combine here, one from Rick Bauman and one from Ron Ratzlaff, having to do with the character of the church and what that means for this connection or relationship. So Rick Bauman writes, for MCC to be a ministry of the church means that the church and its leaders need to want, and that's all in capitals, to provide leadership and governance to MCC. What if those church leaders do not actively seek to engage and involve the churches in governing MCC? Ron Ratzlaff is more of a comment. Also related to, and everybody can see this, about the role of different participants in the wineskins process. But there was an earlier question from Steve Plennert that I think is closely related to Rick Bauman's. It has been said that organizations like MCC presuppose a healthy church. In an era where the power, strength, and authority of the church are diminished, what is the role of MCC in helping the church to be healthy? So he's turning the question around, and Rick Bauman is asking also about relating to the health of the church and what that means for its relationship with MCC. So if you'd care to comment on that.
Yes, thank you very much for those questions. If the church is the body of Christ, as we read and understand in Scripture, and if MCC is part of the body, then when the body is sick, then the knee and the toe and the toenail and the eyebrow still need to do their job in terms of trying to make the body well and make the body better. The fact that the body is sick does not necessarily disqualify the parts of the body from functioning as they were designed to function. I would suggest that that's true for MCC and the church. The fact that the church in many ways is sick and has been throughout the history that we know of does not excuse the body from separating from each other, from separating from itself. So I don't think that the relationship between MCC and the church presupposes that the church is healthy. Neither do I presuppose that that means that MCC is healthy. I think what this presupposes is that together we are the body of Christ in the world, and we function as that. And we help each other. Sometimes MCC will need to help the church be who it is meant to be. And sometimes the church will have to help MCC to be who it might be. So I think it's a very dynamic relationship that includes failure, it includes success, it includes health, it includes illness. And yes, it includes, according to this Urban Peachy's comment here, yes, it includes an agenda that is wide enough to include anything that you can imagine. Ephesians tells us that the plan of God is for the reconciliation of all things, all things, and it repeats it 3 times, all things. There is nothing outside the plan that is not to be reconciled by the church as a primary vehicle for the reconciliation of the world, which is what Ephesians goes on to say. And so there is nothing beyond the agenda of God that is not part of the assignment of the church, whether that is interfaith dialogue, whether that is working without, as somebody suggested, giving aid without being able to name the name, whether that is working with people who are not Christian, or whether that is working, all of that is included once we begin to see the highest common denominator of what it means to be the church. If we keep on simply defining ourselves by the lowest common denominator, of course, almost nothing is possible in that case.
I'm not sure whether people have seen or can see Urbane Peachy's question, to which you just responded. Thank you, Robert. So I'm just going to read it in case people can't see it. Does your ecclesial vision make room for MCC's non-religious humanitarian identity as an NGO or volunteer agency, known clearly as a church-sponsored agency but registered with government or UN agencies as an NGO, where the phrase "in the name of Christ" is not included? So you've just responded to that, as well as to the 2 previous questions. So thank you for bringing that together.
Thank you.
We have one more question here posted that I can see, and I have a question that I've been sitting on for a little bit too. So this is a question that Anna Vogt has posed for Kevin. Did your research highlight any role that advocacy may have played in an invitation to participate in systems or structural change in moving from a neoliberal understanding of relations and connections that involved more than personal transformation through individual acts? How can the language of mutual transformation be used for broader change? I'd also be interested in reflections from the other panelists in the role of advocacy and mutual aid, and also MCC in the church in seeking systemic change. Robert mentioned the advocacy review, and I'd be interested in further reflections about the role of advocacy in the church. So this starts as a question for Kevin and then goes more broadly. So I'll ask Kevin to respond, and then Eric and Robert, if you had any thoughts on that final sentence, I'll come to you third.
Yeah, thank you. So this connects to a big theme in my research in general, which is that I think I find often that the people behind these projects in the 1970s that were so, at least in their kind of public facing efforts in North America, what they tried to get North American church people to do were so focused on personal transformation and so focused on this message that there's like something you can do right now in your life. It's a consumer practice, and thanks to kind of global marketplace, your consumer practice will change things. That message comes up over and over again throughout the 70s, and I see that as a kind of a form of neoliberal thinking. But in the background, and I mentioned this in response to Alan's question as well, I see the MCC leadership talking about the More with Less cookbook and corresponding with Art Simon at Bread for the World and saying, we're totally skeptical about whether this personal transformation stuff is going to do anything, but we at least hope that it gets people to care more about the issues, and it gets them to donate more money for our advocacy work, and it leads to some of this bigger picture structural change that we're more interested in behind the scenes. But the theme and the trend that I noticed across the 70s is that constituencies were perennially unenthused by structural change and policy advocacy. It was just not something that seemed to capture the attention of the MCC constituency or other mainline or evangelical denominational constituencies that had similar programs. So that was kind of the puzzle or the problem. They would pose a kind of individual transformation kind of practice someone could get involved in and hope that it led to greater involvement in bigger picture policy advocacy, and it just never did. And so that's part of why, like, my ultimate sense about this stuff is that kind of neoliberalism and capitalism in general was sort of constraining or disciplining or militating against that bigger picture thinking. Like, even if the folks behind More with Less hoped that it would lead to that, it seems to, among its audience, have really just led to people having like really meaningful diets. So yeah, that's my sense. It's just this kind of gravitational pull toward the individual that seems to keep happening. So yeah, thanks.
Eric?
Yeah, I think it's similar in all sorts of spheres as well. I think about the ESG and SRI movements in investing, that if you invest in the right stocks, then that'll change the structure as well. And so, you know, as long as you invest in these, you know, companies that are working in the right direction, then systemic change might follow suit. And I agree with the skepticism that's going to do the kind of structural change that's needed. I also wonder about the monolithic support from the churches that support MCC. Do they all even agree? And to what extent do they agree? And to what extent do different stakeholders agree about what kind of advocacy ought to be done in what kind of direction? So, you know, my own sort of criticisms of capitalism, right, would not be held by many of the constituencies of those that support MCC. And so there is also some, I think, some tension between how MCC, in doing its work, moves towards the sorts of structural critiques and recognition of structural change, but that how does that siphon back to the church communities that don't necessarily have that vision for it, rather than the personal holiness sort of movements in the midst of that? How does the interchange go backwards? So yeah, so I think there's a lot of really, really complex things to think about there. I'm not sure how we improve that. There's also obviously the sort of politics in the United States, and I think probably in Canada as well, that interplay with all of this as well, and the ways that these have been polarized in some really complex sorts of manners.
Robert, the last sentence of that question was directed to you in terms of having mentioned the advocacy review. Did you want to pick up on that?
Yes, Anna, thank you for that question. Actually, my paper, my longer paper, has quite an extensive section on the question of advocacy and the church and MCC. So you may be interested in getting that longer paper. I'm happy to send it to you. But the answer is yes, of course. I think advocacy for public advocacy for transformation and reconciliation and justice is critical. It's part of the all things that Ephesians talks about that we need to be doing. And I also just noted in the chat that I had put my email there, and I had a typo in the email. So I put it again at the end of the chat, and you'll see my corrected email. So if anybody wishes to have the longer paper where a lot of this is detailed, please do feel free to write, and I can send that to you.
Okay. I'm going to take the liberty now of posing some questions that I had. The first one is for Eric, although I was also thinking about this as I was listening to Kevin's presentation. I was struck at the very helpful and interesting comparisons that you made in terms of mutual aid groups especially the New York kind of based ones, where you were bringing in issues of race and indigeneity in very interesting ways. You know, MCC has done work in those areas, and I thought that was very interesting. I was equally struck, and this came to me first when you were talking about Fretz's model for mutual aid as being the household. that he obviously, and you implicitly, were not thinking about that as also a place where there is unequal power. And that unequal power is often linked to gender roles and gender identity. And just curious whether the question of gender and mutual aid, whether you have thought about that at all, where your thinking is at.
Yes, but not sufficiently, I suppose, is the, the easy way to answer that. I think one of the things that's been really interesting in terms of the non-Anabaptist voices that have really focused on mutual aid has been often people who have all sorts of different sorts of genders, but rarely people who identify as men. The voices have been predominantly in other directions, and I think it is moments of real lived moments where you really realize how little power you have that make mutual aid both a very dangerous proposition, but also something that has the possibility of recognizing the dignity of people. So that those who live with power, comfort, et cetera, don't really think about mutual aid as often, except as perhaps as an ethical should, not as a necessity for surviving, for getting the kids to school, for all the sort of practical needs of life that are not equally shared in all sorts of markers that we might look at in the midst of that. So within Anabaptist circles, it's been very less the case in terms of the research I've seen. It's been predominantly men who have been writing, particularly historically, a little bit less in the present, but partially because a little less is it being discussed in the present than the really flourishing interest that happened in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So there is more work to be done there to think about it, but I guess I'm not surprised by some of that difference in how it's starting to be articulated and expressed.
Okay. And a comment, I guess mostly comment, a bit of a question for Kevin. Your research is focused on the 1970s, and I was struck by what you said about the lack of interest in structural issues amongst North American Mennonites at that point. My own research is on development history, and the 1970s, especially the first half of the decade, were an era of tremendous global energy being devoted to structural change. And so I'm curious whether Robert Suderman's idea of silence might not apply also, for example, during the petroleum boycott that caused long lineups at gas stations in the US. I was living in Kenya at that point, so my memory is of lineups at Kenyan gas stations. But would Mennonites have deliberately had to sort of close their eyes not to have seen structural issues at the point where the new international economic order and the Brandt Commission were saying, we need to pay attention to this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, as my dissertation has developed, I've really, my work's been influenced more, my thinking on neoliberalism has been influenced more and more by this historian Quinn Slobodian, who wrote a book called The Globalists a couple of years ago. And he understands neoliberalism as a system that was developed to manage and maintain power differentials in the post-colonial era, and that he recognizes it, especially in the 70s, as a direct competitor to the NIEO. And he talks about the 70s as a period of like competing world economic imaginaries between neoliberalism, which wants you to think about the individual, it wants you to think about microeconomics and how rational actors can exist in the world, and the NIEO, which wants people to think about nation states and their culpability in these inequities and the structural production of these inequities. And so So the 70s, from what I see in the archive, the way I see people talking about their constituents, I think maybe I was not explaining it well enough if I implied that people did not take notice of the structural problems. They were very aware of the structural problems, exactly like what you're talking about, like the lines at the gas stations, stagflation as like this kind of first pause in economic growth since World War II that happens in the early 70s, where consumer prices are going up and wages aren't. So people are very aware of these things. And the thing that fascinates me is that they seem to then be compelled by a neoliberal economic imaginary that says the way to act in response to the structural pressures you're feeling is through individual consumer choice, or by seizing your role as a rational actor in this new frontier of a kind of worldwide capitalist economy. So just to speak again about more with less, the world food crisis in 73 and 74 is the occasion for publishing more with less. MCC had called on constituents to start donating more money to the relief and development efforts as a reaction to the world food crisis. And in 1974, in the fall, while Doris Longacre was working on gathering up all these recipes, the UN held a World Food Conference in Rome, and there were actually some very concrete structural changes that were made at that conference and that the US signed on to. And just constituents like weren't like compelled by that in the same way that they were compelled by a message about like what I can do in my day-to-day life to feel better about and feel more responsible in relation to these structural problems. So there's a tension, and the tension is what I'm really interested in. There's actually a rich awareness of how structural these things are, but then this sense in which the personal acts are the most compelling and feel the most tangible to people. So Doris Longacre writes in her proposal that she submits for publishing the cookbook that people are responding with a holy fervor and a holy frustration to these structural issues. And the question in their mind is how, and she puts that in all capital. They want a way to act. They want something personal that they can do in their lives in response to structural issues. And that's the thing that I think kind of feeds into some kind of sort of neoliberal logic about like, how do we actually influence or change the structural problems we're seeing? It's through our individual economic behaviors.
Okay, thank you. There are two last questions here in the question and answer. One of them is from Ray Brubaker and maybe a little more comment-ish, but I believe it's mostly directed to Robert. How closely related are funding and denominational ownership? Decades ago, member denominations gave large contributions. When denominational budgets got tight, I heard some churches saying MCC can get its own funding, so we'll cut them from our budgets. Is that a sign of the church releasing MCC to its own devices? Did you want to respond to that, Robert, or just leave that one go? I think we've got about a minute, and there is a question, another question for Kevin as well. Okay, maybe I'll read the question for Kevin. This is unfortunately from someone who is identified as anonymous. As we construct an idealized view of those in other cultures, and then in brackets in retail marketing, but also in fundraising, what are the antidotes you would recommend?
Yeah, so I'm a historian, so I don't have a ton of anecdotes in mind for the future, but I do imagine a world where people would pay for products a fair price that allowed people to make a living wage and didn't require them to be charged with like spiritual meaning or charged with some kind of proof of cultural authenticity in a way that could be transformative for me. Like maybe I could just go buy a bowl for a price that made it so the person who made it could earn a living wage and like not have to have all of this deep meaning behind it, which I think is what then kind of lends into this this fixation on the kind of individual act. So yeah, that I imagine a world where like these products don't have to be sold on the basis of things like this constructed authenticity, and it could just be like a basic desire for people to earn a living wage. That's kind of my reaction to that question. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, we are at 12:30, which thank you. That was just perfectly timed, Kevin. We are at the official end of this session. Unfortunately, I think Robert's internet connection froze and then dropped or got lost at that point. So I'm not sure he will hear this, but a very big thank you to Robert in absentia, and to Eric and to Kevin for their work in terms of the presentations, to the audience for a lot of interesting questions in response to these papers, and that generated some very interesting answer and discussion time. So I will say that we are at an end here, and Ben has asked me to announce, please join us at 1:30 Central Time for our last panel of the conference, Service, Mission, and Partnership. It'll run from 1:30 to 3:30, followed immediately by the conference wrap-up, he says, with, I think, a reminder that that's a slight change from the published guide. So please rejoin us at 1:30 for Service, Mission, and Partnership. The conference wrap-up will follow at 3:30 to 3:45. So that's our message from Ben, our conference organizer. And I think this is the lunch break. So thank you again, and come back later.